This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me. What I try to do with this podcast though is I try and tell the stories, as the title gives it away, of films. And I look at production stories, development stories, behind the scenes stories, marketing stories, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. This episode is one of my occasional special extra episodes where I'm really chuffed to be joined by a very special guest for this one. The guest in question is producer, director and writer Don Hahn, who throughout the 80s and 90s was heavily influential in Walt Disney feature animation. He produced films like Beauty and the Beast and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He went on to produce the live action Maleficent. And then in 2010, he made and released a documentary called Waking Sleeping Beauty, which I think is a really extraordinary film about basically where Disney animation was in the mid-80s to where it got to in the mid-90s. And it's a very warts and all story that I'm thrilled to see has been put on the Disney Plus service. Thinking about it, it might have been a 2009 film. Don't hold me to it either way, and do seek the film out. Now, one of the people featured in Waking Sleeping Beauty is the late great lyricist, composer and producer Howard Ashman, who is credited with really helping find the heart of films such as The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, and also in collaboration with his regular collaborator Alan Menken, was behind the musical Little Shop of Horrors, amongst others. What Don Hahn decided to do after making several documentaries in the 2010s was to go back to the story of Howard Ashman and to tell his story in effectively a self-funded documentary feature. That feature was completed in 2018. It's by the name of Howard. Don Hahn writes and directs the film, and only this year, only in the last couple of weeks as I'm recording this, has the film been made widely available courtesy of the Disney Plus service. I'm thrilled then to bring you a long, extensive conversation with Don Hahn, where he talks about the film, where he talks about working with Howard Ashman, where he tolerates me saying his name in 3 different ways and confusing the name of his production company with a Brian Bosworth action movie of the 1990s. What I'm going to do, I'm going to play you basically the bulk of the trailer actually for the film, and then I'm going straight into my conversation with Don Hahn after this. So without further ado, here's that trailer.
As a lyricist, the last great place to do musicals is in animation.
The combination of Howard Ashman's talent and the Walt Disney name was a home run waiting to happen.
The stuff that was coming out of Howard's pen lyrically was just unbelievable.
It's quiet, you know what I mean?
It's a quiet village.
Yeah.
Howard and Alan Menken had captured the imagination of a generation. We knew something really special was happening, but what we didn't know was that in 9 months, Howard would be gone.
And Howard said, we really have to have a serious talk. I'm sick.
In animation history and in musical history, Howard's mark is indelible.
Me. Yes.
Howard's gift was so strong and his light was so bright that it has not diminished over the years.
That was a clip then from the brilliant Howard, and I'm thrilled to be joined by its director and producer of about 3,000 films that I really love, Mr. Don Hahn. Hello, Don. How are you?
I'm really good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you very much. Do I pronounce your surname correctly? Is it Han or is it Hahn? Are you?
It's Han.
I'm going
It'd be
with
kind of
Hahn then.
fine. Yeah, Don. Yeah.
So it's Don Hahn, he says at
Yeah.
the for. And we've spoken a few times before, back when I was in other jobs, it struck me that the subject really of Howard Ashman, which this film is about, obviously, was always really quite close to your heart and a story you wanted to tell. I wonder if you can just introduce the film to us, just to start us off, and then I'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Howard is a great lyricist, dramatist, director, writer, who sadly passed away during the AIDS crisis back in 1990, 91. And I always felt, I had worked with him on Beauty and the Beast, and he had, of course, written the songs for Little Mermaid, Little Shop of Horrors, Aladdin, and those have become such important musicals, I think, for a number of reasons, not just because they're Disney musicals largely, but because they kind of brought back musical theater, American musical theater in a funny way, which we can talk more about. But he was an important character in my life, and I learned a lot from him because he came to Disney Animation at a time when we really needed him. We were a young studio. We wanted to do interesting work, but we really had lost a lot of our kind of core competencies as a studio and as storytellers. So I always felt like what a great story to tell. It hadn't been told. There's no biography. There's no films or anything about Howard. And so I want to tell that story about this really interesting guy and where he came from and why he was so important to us.
So I'm full disclosure. I think you've probably worked this out by now. I'm a huge fan of a documentary you made. It must be 10 years ago or so now. Waking Sleeping Beauty,
Yes.
and I had another look at that last night, and it struck me that I think it's about 37 minutes into Waking Sleeping Beauty, you introduce Howard Ashman, and then for the next 15 minutes he is that film. And he's the beating heart of so much of that story that you want to tell. He's also, I didn't appreciate until I reminded myself of it, he's basically the last line of the film as well. And so you've directed several documentaries, you've made several excellent documentaries, and I'm curious what the starting point for this one was, because presumably you've come to documentaries in the past almost with an empty box from day one, but you had bits and bobs here, and I'm just curious what it looked like at the point you thought, yeah, this is now another film.
Well, you're right. I had made a Waking Sleeping Beauty, which is, in the end, it's more about executives and Disney and palace intrigue and that kind of thing. And a component of that was Howard. And I always felt from that point like I have so much more to say about Howard. I never imagined making a film about him, though. And for some reason, as time passed, it became more apparent that nothing had been done on him. About 4 years ago, I just had lunch with his sister. We were halfway through my cheeseburger. I just said, I think I have to do this. And it was really impulsive in one way, but it became an obsession of mine. And I think it was largely because I thought this story is going to get lost. And I felt like I wanted to tell it because I knew the connections. I knew how to reach out to people in his life. I knew his family. I knew a lot of the executives and animators that worked with him. And I knew Alan Menken, who was his primary songwriting partner. And so I felt like if I can pull those pieces together and tell his story, maybe it's a short, maybe it's a half hour, maybe I didn't know. And so then I went on a treasure hunt. I went to the Library of Congress, which was where his archives are. I went to Disney. I went to the University of Indiana. All these different places where Howard had been, and found every bit of footage that I could find, and every audio recording and every video recording, because I wanted Howard to tell his own story. I really thought, you have one of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century. Why not have him tell his own story? And so that's what I did. I spent the last 3 or 4 years kind of pulling all that together, because he's a really unique individual. And as I said, not just in the history of Disney, but I just think in American musical theater. And it's been really wonderful and kind of humbling to see the reaction of the film because of that, not just from Disney fans, but really from people who are fans of musical theater, the West End, that kind of thing, know his work and love his work as well.
You mentioned his sister there, Sarah Gillespie, and for a
Yes.
long time, she was the core storyteller of his life through her excellent website.
Yes.
I think it's Part of His World is the website, which again full of tremendous stories. But when you had that lunch with her, and you said, right, it became apparent to you you wanted to make a film. Was she almost your partner on this one? Was it absolutely important that she signed off on it? Because she, understandably, she's quite protective of his legacy as well, in a good way.
Very protective, yeah, in the right way. Very protective. And so, yes, partner is probably not too strong a word. She was really wonderful to work with because she didn't impose herself on the process. She didn't ask to see anything. But I knew that she, and also Bill Lauk, who was Howard's life partner, was an important component to the story as well. I knew they had to trust me, and I knew them for 25 years. So, it wasn't a new introduction. I think later Sarah said she, figured I probably wouldn't make a documentary because other people had told her that over the years. But again, it became an obsession with me. So I would make a section of the movie and send it to her. I'd say, here's 10 minutes, here's 15 minutes, here's Howard in Baltimore, here's what I think about that. And over time, then she was able to mainly help with facts. She was able to say, I have a shoebox in the garage full of photographs of this or that. So I went up to to her house and went through and scanned things, and she was just very open with me about everything, and that's what makes the movie, I think, so personal. Had I struggled with that or had not had a personal connection, I think it would have been much more dry and kind of clinical. But I wanted it to be a more personal movie and have more points of view of people that actually worked with him. I didn't need, Broadway pundits. I didn't need historians. I really wanted people that were firsthand eyewitnesses.
You mentioned a couple of times there your obsession with this. I'm wondering if that's really what's drawn you to documentary, that whether you're doing Handheld, whether you're doing Waking Sleeping Beauty, whether you're doing Howard, that if the filmmaker in you, this is the bit that you love, just that deep research into a subject.
I do, and I appreciate you pointing that out because that's exactly it. I haven't done an animated film in a long time. Most of my career was in animation, and I think people may know me as an animated producer. But it's been about 10 years ago when I made Waking Sleeping Beauty. I really turned a corner, and I just thought, I want another chapter of my life. I had such amazing, life working on Roger Rabbit and Beauty and the Beast and Lion King and all these movies, and I thought. I need to try something else that's a more personal connection to filmmaking, where you're not making a film with 600 people, you're making a film with 6 people. And it's a little bit of a golden age of documentaries right now. Yeah. The ability to tell a story and make a movie with your cell phone is part of it. And part of it is I felt like I wanted to give a voice to people that didn't have a voice. And some of that was going through difficult, political times and elections and things in the States, where I felt like, I didn't want to make political theater necessarily, but I wanted to talk about my artistic heroes. And Howard's one of my artistic heroes. There's plenty of sports heroes. There's plenty of military heroes. Who are the artistic heroes in the world, and how can we hold them up on a pedestal?
Watching Waking Sleeping Beauty and Howard in the same week, one thing, going back to the point you made about who's telling the story just a few minutes ago, one thing that struck me about Howard is that your voice is very quiet in it. That your voice is barely in it, really, just in terms of the narrative and the voiceover. That whereas in Waking Sleeping Beauty, you come in from time to time and move the story along. With Howard, it strikes you don't do that. You are letting the participants tell the story. And I wonder, just from a nerdy editing point of view, just what challenge that is, because that's a slightly different way for you to be telling your stories, it struck me.
It is, yeah. It's fun to tell a story kind of first person, But it goes back to that idea of letting Howard tell his own story and staying out of the way, and that was it was tempting to insert myself more into it sometimes to help turn a narrative corner or to connect the dots in places, and I did.
Yeah.
But the only reason I needed to be in the film was to set it up and say, hi, here's the topic, here's the day when we were recording, here's and to make transitions. I didn't need to be there like a narrator in a traditional documentary and tell you everything. The audience is a real participant in this documentary. The audience has to trust and fill in a lot of blanks in this documentary. And Howard tells his story beautifully. So between Howard and his his close collaborators, it's a slightly different style, but it's something I feel like it works really well for this particular movie.
I agree, and I'm going to come back at you with a particularly dim-witted question, which is simply from us from the outside looking in. When you decide to approach it that way, is it hard? Is it harder to do it that way as a filmmaker?
Yeah.
And what happens then when you're in, if you like, you're in a corner, you're in a dead end in the edit room, and you can't jump in necessarily to sort it out? How does that affect your documentary and your approach to it?
Well, it's a great question. When you have a narrator and when you have talking heads, it's I won't say it's easy, but it's sure easier because you can write your way out of it. You can say, gee, how do I get from this kid in Baltimore to Indiana University to New York? How do I navigate all that? Well, I'll just write the narrator, and the narrator will say, from 1980 to 1982, he did this. And that's just kind of, I don't know, I think it's lazy filmmaking in a funny way. Much better to have someone tell you that. And when I fell off the cliff and didn't have anybody to tell me that, I would really have to dig. Sometimes I would go back to me. Sometimes I would go to a letter and have an actor read it. Sometimes I would go to Sarah or to Nancy Parent, who was Howard's longtime assistant, and say, Nancy, can you come back to the studio? I have a few more questions to ask. And poor Nancy came in about 4 times because she lives close to my studio. And I would say, okay, tell me about this. Like when he went and did Smile with Marvin Hamish, and it fell apart. What happened there? And she would give me these little connective bits that would help to segue the story. So, it's harder, but I love it because it grows out of the eyewitnesses and the people that were there. And it's not just some filmmaker's hand, writing the way through it. So I just love that challenge. It's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together.
I was just wondering that. Did you grow up doing jigsaws?
You have no photograph to say, oh, look, it's a cottage. So you're just trying to piece that all together.
There is one nice side effect for you of just having your voice in both of those films. In that, I looking at the end credits of both, you have someone who dubs your voice internationally. It's the same person. You've kind of got the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing going on here, where Arnie in different European countries has a different person to dub their voice. So somewhere out in the world, there is someone who dubs you into Italian, for instance, on these films. Have you met them? I mean, do you send them Christmas cards? I ask all the killer questions.
No, it's good. It's funny because I would likely say no, but I have met and talked to the gentleman in Italy that dubs all the Italian versions because we're Facebook friends. And I don't even know why we're Facebook friends. So he reached out once and said, hi, you don't know me, but I'm dubbing your movie in Italian. And I said, really? And he had some questions. He had like some script problems and things. And so we went back and forth, and I have no idea what it sounds like, but he had obviously does all the Disney films and is fantastic. So, yeah, what a strange thing that is, huh?
Well, we get Disney Plus in Europe here, so I'll put the Italian track on and I'll let you know. I always got the sense when you made Waking Sleeping Beauty, because you said you've been out of animation effectively for about a decade now, but I got the sense when you made Waking Sleeping Beauty that you were in the perfect place to make that film, that you were just a little on the outside, but you could always pop in for a coffee and you knew everybody. Where were you with this one? Did that still hold true? Was the Contacts book still there? But also, was it, because if I've got this right, you didn't do this through Disney at all. This was through your own company, Stone Cold, I think, off the top of my head.
Stone Circle,
Stone
yes.
Circle, sorry, Stone Cold. That's a Brian Bosworth film. That's terrible. I'm sorry. Stone Circle, of course.
It's a great movie too. Yeah, I did. It was a leap of faith, I suppose, but I felt like the story was compelling enough, and if I did it right, it would find a home. And I did it as an independent film and raised the money for it, and just produced it myself, partially because of the topic. It's a film about a Jewish guy from Baltimore who's gay, who dies in the AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
And all of those don't necessarily tick the Disney boxes. So I felt like this can be sensitive material to part of the audience. I feel like I know the Disney audience quite well. I'm the Disney audience. I understand family movies, and I understand the sensitivity of that. But I didn't want that to edit the movie, and I didn't want that to box in the movie into the kind of film it could be. So I made it myself. And I think our biggest breakthrough is we got accepted into the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. Yeah. And what that did for us is it made us a independent documentary without any strings.
Yeah.
And the audience responded to it really well. And we started to get interest in it from Netflix, from some other people. And luckily, one of those people was Disney. Yeah. And Bob Iger in particular, who was the head of Disney at the time. I sent him the movie. I knew him from animation. I sent him the movie over a weekend, and thinking, well, maybe he'll watch it, maybe he won't. And he did watch it, and he wrote back on Monday and called and said, "This is important. This is our audience. We don't shy away from LGBTQ community. That's part of our audience, and a big part of our audience. And these kinds of stories are important to tell. So it's a very fresh approach to it, but they really embraced it, and Disney Plus was the perfect home for it. We, in fact, finished the movie a while ago and had to wait for Disney Plus to launch before we actually had a home for it. So it was quite a journey, and I'm glad I approached it that way, though, because Disney Plus never came in and said, you have to cut that out, and you have to change that, or whatever. They were always really understanding that this is part of Disney culture, it's part of musical theater, it's part of history, and we want to tell it right.
You talked about musical theatre a little bit earlier, and we said we'd come on to it. But I'm just wondering you've documented in the past Disney animation, but musical theatre you've not really delved into to quite the same degree on screen. Although obviously a lot of your working life has been dominated by musical theatre through the films that you've put out. Can you talk about digging into that world a little bit more, and if that's kind of fueled you a bit more to want to follow that area more as well?
Yeah, I was a music major in all the way through college.
Yeah,
I played percussion. I was a cellist. So I've always been a musician. I always grew up with it around the house and everything else, and I love it. And I think that's why I've made so many musicals as a producer, because I had a vocabulary for music and a love of it. I was never into musical theater. I never hung out on Broadway. I never had any sort of connections with that. But the music itself, I think, was the draw. So really, part of making any movie, especially in documentaries, is you don't necessarily make a film because you know the topic.
Yeah.
You many times make a movie because you don't know the topic. Like I worked on a Disney nature movie called Chimpanzee.
Yes.
I didn't know anything about chimpanzees. And it was with Alistair Fothergill and some of the great, BBC nature veterans. And you end up learning all these amazing things. Like you can take a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee, and it blows your mind. And so that was a little bit what this was. I knew enough of musical theater to be dangerous. Maybe listen to a little bit of it around the house. But then, having access to somebody like Alan Menken, who's made his life in theater, or Jodie Benson, who does the voice of Ariel.
Yeah.
You have complete access then to some really interesting people who can explain that to you. And I had access to Howard, who could explain that to us. And so that's the leap of faith you take as a documentarian, is not that you know everything, but that you know enough to find the people that know everything.
there are sequences in the film which I enjoyed immensely, where you zero in on this 99-seat theatre that Howard and a group of collaborators had come together in. I think you phrase it along the lines of a fairly unsavoury part of New York.
Yes.
I think I can say that and get away with it. And
Yes.
how he was going completely off kilter, completely off beam as to where everyone else was going in musical theatre at that time. It got me curious how much of that you knew when he came into your world in the first place, and and from that point forward, as you dug into it and you discovered, what insights were you getting off collaborators from that era, and what did you learn about him that you didn't know? Because you talk about documentaries as a learning for you as well.
Yeah, I knew none of that. It's funny, you think you know someone because you work with them. And of course, the people we work with, we might know when their birthday is and who they're married to or whatever, but you don't really know anything about them.
Yeah.
That was the case with Howard. I knew enough. I knew his sister. I knew a few people. So when you start digging in and find out, oh, yeah, he's, in his 20s, right out of university with his master's degree, moves to New York, which at the time was affordable to do. And not only moves there, but starts his own theater. It's jaw-dropping because you couldn't do that now. I walked by the building where Howard's theater was in when we were making the film, and it's very gentrified. It used to be very seedy and kind of down market, and now it's all Crate and Barrel and Pottery Barn and that kind of thing, and so you realize, first of all, New York had that element to it. It was full of students. It was full of young people who didn't even aspire to go to Broadway. They were doing this off-Broadway thing that was this passion of legitimate theater where you're really there in the presence of a small, intimate audience. It's something that exists still, but at the time it was on fire.
Yeah.
And you would have people, celebrities and the kind of upper crust of New York driving down Fifth Avenue to get to this seedy part of New York where it's Skid Row and kind of dangerous outside to see Little Shop of Horrors.
Yeah.
And it was a great night out. So it was a special time. I think the 70s and 80s in New York where you could have that young and hungry group of artists and directors and choreographers and actors that would put on that off-Broadway theater. And you talk to those people now, and they look back on it with almost as though it were religion, because it's so hard to find now. There's wonderful Broadway going on, but in a 2,000-seat theater with a corporate world behind it, it's just a different animal. So to discover that about Howard and discover his hunger for theater and storytelling, he wasn't making money. He was writing cover copy for Grosset and Dunlap, a publisher, on the side just to make ends meet. But he loved theater and he had to do it. It was his obsession. So to be able to uncover that, to be able to walk by that building, to be able to see the chutzpah, the feeling that he must have had to be able to do that was really eye-opening, because we got Howard later in his career when he had some successes. And so to tell that part of the story, I think it just shows the drive behind it. It also shows, yes, he was talented, and yes, he probably was a genius, but he also paid his dues. He put in his work. He had his master's degree in directing theater. He was an actor in a lot of theater. He wrote screenplay. He wrote plays and musicals. So he wasn't just a dilettante who kind of showed up and expected everybody to follow him. He really dug in and paid his dues and did the work. And that was inspiring to me, too.
And yet when he came into, as your film documents, as he came into Disney's life and as he came into your life, consequently, he was, career-wise, at a low. I mean, you really get this point across that he'd put his energies into a musical that just hadn't worked. And I'm curious if you remember, I mean, it's a fairly obvious question, but I'm curious if you remember that first meeting and if you got a sense of just what was under the surface with him.
Well, he hid it well from us, as most of us do. Most of us wear a pretty effective mask from our coworkers. But digging into that story, he was pretty devastated. And I think when Howard did get bad reviews, or something didn't work, which happened frequently, he wasn't necessarily that immediately resilient person. It took him a while to process. It took him a while to recover from it. Disney was at the right place at the right time, I think, to help him recover from that kind of loss on Broadway. He when he collaborated with Marvin Hamlish. So we didn't see it though. And when I personally met with him the first time, I had been in London working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
I had a great experience there, and then started working on Beauty and the Beast in London also.
Yeah.
And we storyboarded about 20 minutes of the film, and then came to Florida, and Howard was in Florida for the Little Mermaid press junket, so he had already written Little Mermaid when I met him.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect movie. There's just in terms of its musical content. And he had a gap in his schedule because Aladdin, which was his next kind of contribution, had fallen apart story-wise. So we were just lucky. We were in the right place at the right time and grabbed him, and he got it. He understood. He said, oh, yeah, Beauty and the Beast. This is like The King and I. This is like Cuban Psyche. This is like Cyrano. And he just understood what that story needed to be. And we jumped in and started working with him.
When it came to working with him on Beauty and the Beast, then, which of course you produced, and again, this is a beautifully dim-witted question, of which I continue to pride myself on.
Excellent.
But
I'll give you an answer as well.
But I mean, when you're working on a film, as much as it's a collaboration, if you're the producer of that film, are you technically his boss on that film?
Yeah.
And as a consequence of that, because, I mean, there are stories in Howard and there are stories in Making Sleeping Beauty that almost make him sound like an unmanageable human being. And I'm curious what it was like for you in the cauldron of that you very, I mean, you don't shy away from the point that he didn't suffer fools gladly at all. There's a beautiful drawing in there of him basically just erupting. I think, is it Kurt Wise or Gary Trousdale, the Beauty and the Beast directors? And I'm curious what it was like for you with a bunch of upset people on one side and a genius on the other side, and trying to manage that process, really.
Well, it's a great question. The word manage is not applicable.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can manage people in an office situation or a factory situation, but I think it's more herding cats. You're trying to work with artists and egos that are collaboratively trying to make a film, and that's really difficult. Luckily, I think most of us on the animation side were somewhat deferential to Howard, mainly because he was contributing these giant songs to our movie, and they were fantastic songs. So you wanted to kind of stay out of his way in that way. We weren't afraid to push back, and he was collaborative. He wasn't a stone wall, so you could have a dialogue back and forth with him, but he clearly was very opinionated about what he wanted. And I think you just have to be in the room and face that. He could have been a trial attorney, I suppose, because Howard was so articulate about what he wanted that you had to be ready with a defensive conversation if you wanted to come up with something that was against an idea he had. But again, he was collaborative if he understood what you were trying to get at.
Yeah.
But you had to bring your A game. You couldn't be lazy about that because he was so articulate about things. He was funny, he was affable, and he was also one of the biggest hearted people I've ever worked with.
Yeah.
Most empathetic and loving people. You don't write songs like Part of Your World or Kiss the Girl or Beauty and the Beast without having a big heart. So sometimes with that comes, a difficult personality. We all have that, I suppose. And I think that's probably one of my skill sets as a producer is understanding that and working with people like that. And I had just come off of Who Framed Roger Rabbit and worked with Richard Williams, who's a genius animator and difficult. And I kind of love that. I don't know why. I just love supporting people who are brilliant at what they do. And certainly Howard with that.
I've never got the image of you going for the easy life and just reclining with a book and a whiskey and like a good cigar and just taking the easy path out. I'm deliberately trying not to give too much of what's in the film away, because I think it's really important for people to watch it, really, as much for accessibility and making things reachable. And I did want to come to that I've interviewed you before, for instance, on The Lion King, and you were really open that with a year to go on The Lion King, that film was, I think you used the word shambles. It was in a state, and how The Lion King was finished in people's garages because of an earthquake. And here you show, and here and across Waking Sleeping Beauty as well, you show animators basically working, we call them porta cabins here in the UK, but just temporary buildings, it looks like. Yeah. Is part of your drive behind that to make all of this reachable? Because I think if a youngster now watches something like Frozen, that looks really hard to do. But when we're seeing making of stories like this, I wonder if part of that is to show people that actually it's just human beings.
It really is. And I think part of that too is Disney is an easy banner to hide behind. Both for people who are within Disney and people who are outside of Disney looking in. You just think that's insurmountable. I can't go there. I mean, I thought that when I was 16 years old. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to work there, but I'll never get in. So I think putting a face on that's important, just to say we're human beings. We put our pants on one leg at a time, most of the time. And
speak for yourself, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to humanize that is important. I don't know why it's important. I just feel like there's so many obstacles to a person who wants to make a living in the arts. There's it's very hard to say, hey, mom and dad, I'm going to go off and be a dancer. So I feel like it's important to say, no, there is life in the arts. There is real people who have real passions and real aspirations. And Disney is human beings. Trying to make a good movie, and making a good movie is hard for anyone at any company. So to humanize that's always been important to me, and to demystify that's always been important to me. It's too easy to say, oh, weren't we great, and weren't we brilliant when we did this, and how fantastic we were when we made that decision. That may be true in retrospect. But at the time, we didn't necessarily think that way at all. We weren't walking around going, hey, this is a great renaissance of animation, isn't it? You don't do that. You're struggling to just put the pieces together and tell a story. And that struggle is why we do it. And I think that's why anybody gets into the arts, whether you're a painter or a dancer or a chef or whatever.
There's an extraordinary sequence in the film that I do just want to touch on. Although I should note, yours is the only film I've ever seen where Angela Lansbury explains how to make a cup of tea. And I think that needs to be put out there. Presumably, with your own love of tea, there was no way that wasn't making the edit.
It was the first thing in the movie. Just imagine yourself, if you're a filmmaker and you have archival footage from now 30 years ago of Jerry Orbach and Angela Lansbury talking about how to properly steep the tea in the pot, not in the cup. Why wouldn't you put that in the film? She's amazing. She's celebrating her birthday coming up here in October, and she is a treasure.
I think it's worth putting on record as well. She does use the word steep as well. I mean, she's no amateur when it comes to tea making.
She's the real deal.
That sequence that follows that in the film, where you're all listening to the playback of Be Our Guest, and I mean, it's so unfussy the way you've done it in the movie. You just don't get in the way of that at all. And there's this figure at the back, Howard, at the back of that shot. And it just struck me as one of the most bittersweet things I've seen in a movie in an awful long time. And I'm just wondering what the impact on you as a human being is, revisiting some of that. Because these were presumably very big highs and very big lows for you, all encapsulated as well.
Yeah, I think by the time that scene you're describing happened, we knew Howard was sick. He looked like it. Yeah. I remember that day I specifically asked him beforehand if it was okay if we filmed, because in some sense, he didn't want to be filmed and remembered as that. He didn't want to have AIDS define his life.
Yeah.
And I think that's obviously right. But he said yes, and he said it was okay to film. So we filmed, and it kind of tells its own story, because you see this man who's lost a lot of weight, hasn't lost a thing in terms of his passion for the work. And bittersweet is a word one could use to describe that.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard to lose anybody in your life, and then to lose somebody who was such a beacon for us was difficult. To revisit it, though, I felt that it was important to show all that. I felt really good about it, actually, because the alternative was to let that film sit on a shelf for the rest of eternity.
Yeah.
And so by pulling it out and trying to put that sequence together and showing Howard at work is what I wanted to do. I wanted people to see his process. I wanted people to be instructed by how he worked and how good he was with actors and how he would give line readings and talk to these people in a vocabulary that was so warm and so welcoming. That was important to me. So I felt like, yeah, this guy had a tragic end to his life, but people need to see who he was and understand why he was who he was. And to be able to just sit back and be voyeuristic almost and stand there. I mean, I'm on the right side of the frame in those shots, standing there with a giant donut. But I feel like that was important. I wanted to put the audience in the rooms I was in. I wanted to put the audience at the tables I was at, to be able to let you see first person what was going on.
There are moments, though, in your film where you leave quite a few expanses of silence. And I think the temptation oftentimes with, at the very least, some very gentle music in the background, I think oftentimes the temptation with filmmakers is to fill silence with noise. But you seem quite clear that you want to let these moments rest and let these moments play out. And I just wonder if you can take me into the editing decisions you were making there.
Well, a lot of it's intuitive. I had a great editor, Stephen Yao, who was also very intuitive, and also our love of music was part of that. Alan Menken, I showed him the movie right before the holidays. This has been a few years ago when we were finishing it. And I just wanted him to see it and check it for facts and things. And he phoned me back and said, I'm going to write the score for this. And I said, well, I can't afford you. And, it's a documentary. I have $5. And he said, I don't care. I just need to do this, because for him, it was his last chance to collaborate with Howard and make a tribute to it. So Alan wrote the score for it. And so in some sense, that was enough narrative and that was enough storytelling. I didn't need words. And to be able to stay out of the way and let Alan speak through his music in places was more effective than anything I could come up with. So it's an intuitive thing with me of just trying to say, here's a difficult emotional moment to get through. You don't need talking heads over the top of that. The audience is a lot smarter than we know, and to give the audience credit and say, here's 2 + 2, you come up with a solution, I love that as a filmmaker, because I think the audience does that and wants to do that, and the audience participates in the movie much more that way. So to stay out of the way and let the music tell the story, or let the silence tell the story, allows the audience to steep in those thoughts.
I'm liking this word steep. I'm
trying to bring it back. Yeah,
I think so. I think we could get this in a little bit more and just try. Well, it's interesting, particularly with Alan Menken as well. That he came round to the UK for the press tour when the live action Beauty and the Beast came out, and I remember asking him then, how did it feel revisiting all of that with Howard, without Howard, and he just said it felt like someone was missing in the room. And I'm curious, as you were putting the film together, if you got a bit of sense of that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I tried not to think about it too much, because it could be intimidating. You could be sitting there in editing thinking, what would Howard do? So I never tried to think that. But the more I listened to Howard, the more I listened to his tapes, his work tapes, him singing songs. I put in, I think there's 23 songs in this movie in part. And it was a chance to hear Howard sing. So the more I heard that, the more I wanted to put that in the film, and just kind of expose who Howard was as a person. And 30 years have passed, so I wanted to be that's enough time probably to step away from some of the genuine sadness and loss and just look at it somewhat dispassionately. And while you're making a movie, you show it to people. I did small family and friends screenings, invite 10 people over with a glass of wine and get some feedback from them. So that process is effective in kind of, getting to the core of the story.
At the point when Disney, when it was clear, when you had that call from Bob Iger, I've just read his book actually. I like the bit where he talks about Michael Eisner, former head of Disney, saying micromanaging is underrated. And I just imagine him saying that at the front of a room and how well something like that would go down. But at the point it became an official Disney project, because I did write down here, and you've touched on it a little bit earlier, that there's cigarettes, there's sexuality, there's facial hair. You've got a clip of John Waters' female trouble in the film as well. Was there any pressure at all to change the film one frame? Because Disney Plus has obviously got an upper limit on its, I think it's got a PG-13 limit in the US, 12A here. But was there any kind of just tailoring it once you knew where it was going to go?
The only thing I did, and they asked me to do, was to make changes, I think probably similar to what they did on Hamilton when it was on Disney Plus. So there's some, profanity or things that I bleeped or cut out.
Yeah.
Just to take the edges off a couple of moments that were too edgy.
Yeah.
But I honestly was never asked to remove anything that was perhaps seen as untypically Disney. And there is, as I said, the AIDS crisis is not a pleasant thing. But what I always thought is, if you can deal with these topics in an authentic way and in an honest way, where you're not salacious and you're not trying to put forward an agenda of any kind, you're just really presenting the facts to a jury. It's hard to argue with that because it's factual. And so as factual as I could be, I thought that's the way to tell this story. And the guys and girls at Disney understood that. So they were genuinely supportive. I also think in establishing Disney Plus, and I can't speak for them, but they really wanted to be seen as a studio that could make documentaries like that and tell authentic stories, that it didn't have to be all Pollyanna, that as brilliant as Pollyanna is, you could also have the opposite end of the bell curve and have documentaries that dealt with real life situations. So I admire them for that. And they're becoming known for that too, which is terrific.
Well, in the midst of Waking Sleeping Beauty, there's animators reenacting Apocalypse Now, isn't there? I think that's stayed in place.
Yeah.
Is there a bit on the cutting room floor where a bunch of animators did RoboCop or something?
No, but there's some unspeakable bits on the cutting room floor that should. We've talked before about Waking Sleeping Beauty, and I'm conscious I've horribly overrun my time, but I'm just pushing my luck with one more question, if that's all right. Please do.
You started Waking Sleeping Beauty at the end of that story. You've got a voiceover where you talk about how the wheels were about to come off the cart. And that film set up, for those who haven't seen it, it obviously tells the story of Disney animation from its resurgence from Black Cauldron through to The Lion King. And it leaves it at such a tipping point. And I asked you this 10 years ago, and I'm determined whenever I get to interview you again, I'm going to ask it again, because you're setting up something like a Don Hahn animated documentary universe here, I think. We'll have to come up with an acronym for it. But you said you couldn't make the next bit of that story 10 years ago because it was all too raw for people concerned, that time had to pass. And the way I see it, from my nice, simple place in the West Midlands in the UK, 10 years has passed. And I'm just wondering if that's something you'd revisit and tell that story of what happened to Disney with the brilliant Hunchback, which you produced. I adore that film. But the Hunchback era through to that run of films, which don't get the credit they deserved, but are just deemed as this down era for the studio.
Well, it's a... great question. Time has passed. I have never thought about it up until 30 seconds ago.
Okay.
Here's the thing that's still raw. at the time, it was difficult because animation was going through a different chapter, and people were getting laid off. There were literal consequences. People were losing their houses and things like that because it was fading as a business. What was replacing it was Pixar, and Pixar was thriving. That's a film that Leslie Iwerks made about the Pixar story that's interesting. So it's a story of loss. It's like saying, I'm going to take my favorite football team, and I'm not going to tell you the story of their winning season. I'm going to tell you the story of when they just couldn't win.
Yeah.
And when they just were devastated in the locker room and they couldn't put two things together. That's a story that people probably don't flock to, that people necessarily don't want to see. But one could argue that maybe now, after all this time, with movies like Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph and Zootopia winning Oscars and things, you could chronicle that era as well. I don't know if that's me immediately. I think part of why I was so passionate about making these films is I lived them, that I was there. And I do believe in making films or writing books about things you know and love. So I could do it as a third person on the outside, but I think what makes those movies that I made interesting is I was there.
Yeah.
I admire Disney animation. I admire Pixar. There's so many great films coming out of animation right now. But there's 25 or 30 movies a year now that are animated.
Yeah.
When we were making Black Cauldron, there was one movie a year. So there was a story to tell there that was really compelling as a movie. And I'm not sure that story is there anymore.
So you said that that's not you at the moment. So inevitably, what is you at the moment? What's occupying your head? What are the projects you're pursuing? Because you've written so many books. You've made an awful. I'm looking at a screen here that's just got a list of all your films on it, and it's incredible. I mean, there's no two ways about that. But I'm curious, what next? Because you've got a lot left to give.
Thank you for saying that. I do. That artistic heroes idea I talked about a few moments ago is something that haunts me. And there are so many untold stories. There's people like Mary Blair, who was one of Walt Disney's closest artists and confidants. And you would know her work if you saw it. There's amazing artists within and without Disney whose stories haven't been told. Everybody knows who Frank Lloyd Wright is as an architect. Everyone knows who Jackson Pollock is as a painter, or Picasso. But there's so many people that contributed to popular culture and our society whose stories haven't been told, who are interesting and fascinating, and the story of the human journey that's so amazing to me. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm reading a lot of biographies about interesting people whose stories might be worth telling.
I wish you the very best of luck with them, and I thank you so much for joining us on this podcast, and thank you for letting me horrifically overrun as well.
No, it's always good talking to you. We don't get a chance to talk very often, and I love what you do, and it's really great to talk because your questions are always uncomfortable and wonderful.
They're always dim. That's what I pride myself on.
No.
They're steeped in dimness.
Not at all.
No, I appreciate enormously your time. Thank you very much. And with that, my time with Don Hahn came to an end. You can find Howard on the Disney Plus service now. You can find Waking Sleeping Beauty there as well. You can find me on Twitter if you want to hear more of my warblings at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. The website, www.filmstories.co.uk, has a whole host of features, news stories. It's updated every weekday with lots and lots of stuff. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere. youtube.com/filmstories, and you'll find video exclusive film stories there. And with that, I shall leave you in peace for the time being. Huge thanks to Don Hahn for his time, and thanks for you for listening and for supporting my work. It's all hugely appreciated. You all take care, you all look after yourselves, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories.